Pilot Mountain became a state park in 1968 to protect the mountain and surrounding areas.
Over the past decade, fires, we've had prescribed burns in 2012 and 2019 on the mountain section of the park. So we try to keep around, a 5-year interval, give or take. And we've also done active burns on the river section as well. Before Pilot Mountain was a public attraction, obviously that was before it was a state park as well, local people, I've heard, would burn the mountain down just on occasion. It's a kind of an annual thing. And, mainly they would do that for either timber stand improvement or wildlife management. And it was just something that was done. And ever since it's become more of a tourist spot, you had the fire suppression efforts in the mid-20th century and everything like that went into effect. We really restricted what had been historically a common occurrence.
At 3:30 p.m., Saturday, November 27th, 2021, a fire was reported in the area of the Grindstone Trail on Pilot Mountain. North Carolina Park Rangers and North Carolina Forest Service County Rangers, along with other personnel, were the first responders.
Call first came in, I guess a lot of either visitors driving into the park or passing by the park from the highway could see it. So they were calling in to dispatch 911 about they see flames up Pilot Mountain. And I even had a couple employees calling that lived nearby that could see, and was catching word of it.
Several folks in the Shoals community, which is on the west side of the mountain, actually could see it from their homes, and then it was reported and also posted on social media, which also incurred a lot more phone calls to our Surrey County Communications. It was about 2 to 6 foot flame leaks, and we had upslope winds that was pushing the fire up the mountain. The fire was actually located on the upper ledge of the Grindstone Trail, and it was pretty intense the way it was pushing up the hill. We did have a thermal belt that night, which was where we were experiencing warmer air at the top part of the mountain, and so it was feeding the fire, so it was a lot more intense.
This is a good area to show you an opening in the ledges that acts like a chimney and pushes the winds up slope that would help drive the fire the initial night of the Grindstone.
I immediately called our district ops officer that evening to notify him of the fire and also go ahead and request to have a dozer en route due to the time it takes to get one to this location. And then when I arrived on the scene, we were still unable to locate the fire. I had several different fire departments out looking for it. So I worked quickly with the state parks folks to gain access to the Grindstone Trail because it's over 3 miles, and the call just said it was on the Grindstone Trail, so we was needing to narrow down that location. We knew that we had daylight was becoming very slim, so it was getting dark quickly, and also if it's on the Grindstone, there's also the ledges there, so there's a lot of safety complexity involved with our initial attack.
Well, I got a call about 8 p.m. that Saturday night saying that they did have a fire on Pilot Mountain. They needed a PIO there first thing the following morning. I think that was Sunday morning that I arrived. Saw some pretty spectacular footage online that night, pictures that people were taking alongside of 52, and it was pretty spectacular. Probably, when they called me, they were just guessing 20 to 30 acres, and then later on that night, maybe 60 acres. And then when I got on scene that morning, it was roughly about 180 to 200 acres.
Over the next 10 days, North Carolina Forest Service fire crews, along with local and state personnel, worked to contain the fire, which resulted from an abandoned campfire in an unauthorized area on the mountain.
It is believed that the campfire was over here. It had been abandoned for a couple of days, and due to the drying conditions that we were experiencing at the time, that it kind of skunked around in the duff before actually turning into a complete wildfire that it was that Saturday night.
Yeah, typically the area of origin is going to be lower intensity burn. It just, like Janet says, as it kind of skunks around before it really kind of takes off and builds steam on its own. So.
If I say it was difficult to get to, it was difficult to get to that night because we were trying to send folks in from the top and then we couldn't. And then when I come in from the bottom, I could only get to one point. So when we hiked down and was like right below us, this entire ledge system was on fire at that point.
We were very successful in a very timely manner was very impressed with the resources that was brought in to assist with this fire and the strategies that we utilized to maintain it. We were able to, there was very few spots that we even didn't have to worry about. The crews that worked and did it, what little burnouts was done, they were done successfully and done in a very strategic manner.
The IMT, our incident commander, ultimately made that decision how we were going to suppress the fire. And the way we were going to suppress the fire was we weren't going to try to hold it where it was at. It was too dangerous for our firefighters. The terrain was too rough, too difficult. So basically they were going to send in the fire crews and help the fire along, bring it down the mountain, and then tie in with those dozer lines, and then just basically do a burnout operation at that point. And then it went very smoothly, went very well, and then we were able to wrap that, what basically wound up being 1,080-acre fire within just a few days, and we were able to turn it back over to the park system then at that point. I think that it would have been a very extended attack opposed to being out here, 5 or 6 days before we handed it back over to the park completely. I think we could have been out here for several weeks, well through the holidays even.
Prescribed fire is an age-old practice that was part of everyday life for Native Americans and early settlers. Today, it remains one of the most effective tools helping North Carolina forests remain healthy and thrive.
The prescribed fire program for the Division of Parks and Recreation is, I wouldn't say it's in its infancy. It was in its infancy when I started with the division back in 2003, and it's grown a lot since then. So, we're working on implementing plans at every single state park. Pilot Mountain has been one of the leaders in terms of frequency of burns and active areas under prescription. Well, I would say everything that burned last year at Grindstone was scheduled to be burned under prescription within the next 1 or 2 years. So if anything, it just jump-started us a little bit. When we try to burn something, at least some tracts, parcels every year, weather permitting and staffing permitting. So we have active burn units here on the mountain, as you well know, as well as on our river section on the Ackenbrook. Since coming here to Pilot Mountain, I've heard a lot of words used to describe the Grindstone Fire. I've heard the word devastating thrown around a whole lot. And I always like to take a moment when people say that and try and do a little bit of education. Had it not been for the active prescribed fire management program in the past decade here at Pilot Mountain, last year's Grindstone Fire very well could have been devastating. But since we have burned the mountain twice, at least in the past 2 years, that did a whole lot to reduce the hazard fuels that had accumulated over the past 75 years when the mountain was a state park and a private attraction and it didn't burn at all. So I'd like to emphasize the benefits of prescribed fire, not just hazard fuel reduction, but for wildlife management. It improves wildlife habitat, as well as for silviculture. We have a lot of fire-dependent species here at Pilot Mountain. And when you go out into the park after a fire like Grindstone, as you'll see later on, you can see evidence of where these fire-dependent species are resprouting and, in essence, thriving after the fire moved through. We make sure, besides the obvious weather conditions, humidity, temperatures, wind speeds that we have to abide by, we make sure to have the staff on hand that we need, as well as the fire lines already prepped in advance. This isn't something we just wake up one day and say, hey, we're going to burn this piece of property today that hadn't burned in 100 years. These plans take months to prepare, sometimes years of planning before we actually implement one of these prescribed burns. So besides the weather conditions being right, we want to make sure we have the staffing available and the lines prepped and ready to go. We do everything from blowing off the lines to managing them, scraping them down to mineral soil so that the fire doesn't cross the lines. And we make sure to take care of any snags that are, within 30, 40 feet of the fire line so that they don't come down and cross the line. So we do a lot of prep before the actual day of the burn.
I think since 2012, the active role the state park system has taken with their prescribed fire program, just like you said, Janet, educating the public, helping them to understand that not all fire is bad, has helped things a lot since then. So, yep.
Yeah, they've really grown because state parks have been doing prescribed burning since the 70s, especially in the coastal plain. But to get it into the mountains and stuff, it has definitely been a challenge for them and to mitigate and wanting to take on larger burn units and stuff, because the very first prescribed burn done here at Pilot was a half an acre, and it was on the little pinnacle, and it was a demonstration and stuff, and that was back in 2003. So they've come a long way in 20 years.
Prescribed fire in certain counties can be very challenging, like Guilford County and Forsyth County. We've got a landowner that wants to do an in-stand burn on a pine plantation in northeast Guilford County. We've got a school just south of that plantation. We also have subdivisions east and west, so we have to pick our days and be really careful. We've got to look for a day where we've got a southerly wind out of the south to transport that smoke north. So we really have to be very careful when picking and choosing what days we burn in those urban counties.
In the years since the Grindstone Fire, we have observed wildlife and natural vegetation return to its pre-fire condition and, in several cases, improve.
Yeah, regrowth has definitely happened after an event like that the following spring. You have a lot of the blueberries already starting to come back and everything greens up fast. And after the first leaf fall, as is evidenced today, you're hard pressed for most visitors to see where the fire exactly was.
The landscape has recovered greatly. Even by the springtime, we can see how everything was blooming. All the leaves were coming on the trees. Wildflowers were abundant. So we could see all that happening.
This little pine right here is popped up since the fire. And depending on where you go on the mountain, even driving up the road on the left-hand side, you'll see larger areas. You'll see different pine species that are now growing.
There was less than 10% tree death in the park, which is great.
Either at this height, which is about halfway up my knee, or some that are almost that high now, that have grown since the fire, since all this pine got opened up.
But everything was growing and coming back the way we would want it to be. The only thing we kept an eye on was the actual kind of immediate forest area around the Pilot Knob area itself. That was where we saw a little bit slower growth throughout the year. But everything bloomed this year. The leaves were full, and most visitors were like, where was the fire at? They couldn't even tell where it was driving into the park or even driving up to the summit. And most areas we had pointed out to where you could still see some slower regrowth, and that was areas they could see okay, I guess there was a fire there.
Here at Pilot, one thing I didn't mention is they have the Table Mountain pine.
There's serotinous pine cones, and so they actually have a waxy cover on the outside, and when heat is around them, they start to release. It's kind of like popcorn, where they release their seed, and actually their seed looks like a piece of charred bark, so that way the birds don't pick them up until they can establish. So our dog fennel, you'll see this all along the trails. They have really done well since the fire. I think it's opened up some area for them to grow. Right now their seeds are going across, getting ready for production of next year. And these plants are really fun with kids because they can grow taller than most people. It's a chestnut oak acorn, and it's already starting to germinate there in the origin area of the Grindstone Fire.
Now, will that mean a tree will grow there?
If an animal doesn't take it off or the wind doesn't blow away.
Okay.
Chestnut oaks are pretty resilient, and they will grow in most places, especially just you can look around here. These have to have shallow root systems to be able to grow on this rock face. So a lot of times, like the Table Mountain pine, you'll actually see their root system just laying on top of the rock, and it's pretty amazing how they can withstand all the winds that come up the side of the mountain. And chestnut oaks the same way.
Wildlife activity was present literally as soon as the ground started cooling. We had white-tailed deer moving their way through the campground and through the woods. You could see them at night kind of patrolling around. Those are the biggest animals that we could see actually moving. During my presence during the fire and other people out in the backfield, the good thing is we didn't find any what we call remains of any animals that got caught up in the fire. I think most animals were easily able to get away, or like our box turtles, they're able to dig underground before the fire came over. And since it was an extremely intense fire on the ground, that really helped with the survival rate as it went across. And of course, with it being in the fall, a lot of our birds have already hatched, started flying, and was able to get away easily.
We have our black vultures and our turkey vultures that call Pilot Mountain home. We do have some that migrate through, but a lot of them do stay here, and we've seen them thrive here even after the fire.
Once the summit cooled down, they started flying right back around it again. And of course, they're our natural cleanup crew anyway with the highway close by, so they still had their home here. They were always able to fly away to get away from the fire and then come back nice and easy. And this year, they had a great migratory bird count. So that was with their hawks, different type of songbirds that were coming through. All those were able to be counted, and we didn't see any major change in that. If anything, we saw some good growth.
Prescribed burning is actually a good proactive tool so you can reduce the fuels so you're not having to be reactive in a time of wildfire.
We don't want that lone lightning strike or that one camper that's there where they shouldn't be the cause of a truly devastating fire that gets up into the crowns of the trees and totally wipes out our home forest. We don't want that to happen. So that's one of the many reasons that we do these prescribed fires. So that if we have a fire like Grindstone, which was an illegal campfire, that's how it started. So that when you have a fire like that, it doesn't become devastating. And like I said before, it would have been had we not been doing fire management for the past decade here.